All right, we're going to focus now on exercise metabolism. So, some of the objectives of this lecture include discussing how the different energy pathways are utilized during exercise. We'll talk about the use of different nutrients, mainly carbohydrates and fats, during exercise. We'll talk a little bit about lactate and its role, oxygen consumption, and how it responds to exercise. We'll discuss something called the respiratory quotient or the respiratory exchange ratio. And then lastly, we'll talk about how we can use oxygen consumption to estimate energy expenditure. So a little bit about fuel utilization during exercise. So if we compare it to what we see at rest, so these are obviously approximate numbers, but at rest, it's kind of assumed that the breakdown's like this. So we're metabolizing about 60% fat, 35% carbohydrate, 5% protein. That's a relatively good estimate for a healthy adult in a normal metabolic state. During exercise, this is going to change, and it's really going to change depending on the intensity of the exercise and the duration of the exercise. So when we look at intensity, it's pretty clear cut. So generally speaking, lower intensities, the body relies more on fat, higher intensities, more carbohydrate. And so that gives us something called the crossover concept. And so if we look at this graph, you can see why it's called the crossover concept. So you'll see a lot of graphs like this throughout the semester. On the x-axis, we have exercise intensity, which is listed as a percentage of their VO2 max or maximal capacity. And then on the y-axis, we have energy, percent energy from fat versus carbohydrate. So as you can see, as intensity goes up, the body relies less and less on fat as a substrate and more on carbohydrate. And you get this crossover point that will depend, this crossover point varies depending on the individual, but that's why this is called the crossover concept, because there's a crossover point where you switch from mainly using fat to mainly carbohydrate. Mechanisms for this include, as intensity goes up, more anaerobic metabolism, and we know that we cannot use fat anaerobically, but we can use carbohydrate anaerobically. Fiber type recruitment. Muscle fibers, generally speaking, there's two major types, fast versus slow. As intensity goes up, you do tend to utilize more fast muscle fibers, which have a better ability to undergo anaerobic metabolism and thus use carbohydrate. Another thing that's really important is carbohydrates as a fuel are just more efficient. And we'll talk about that later in this lecture. But efficiency-wise, carbohydrates are definitely more efficient than fat. And then lastly, carbohydrate metabolism is just a little bit faster. So it makes sense as intensity is going up to metabolize something that can be utilized for ATP transfer relatively quickly. When we look at duration, you see another thing. It's not quite as clear, but so assuming a constant intensity, and we'll say a submaximal intensity that could be running on the treadmill at a given speed, let's say 5-6 miles an hour, something like that. And look at exercise time on the x-axis, and then percent fat or carbohydrate on the y-axis. You can see as time increases, so as you go from, let's say you're doing a long run, an hour to 2 hours, you basically shift from kind of a mix of fat and carbohydrate to relying more and more on fat. So again, this is not quite as clear as the previous crossover concept, but this is the general pattern that you'll see over time. And generally you'll see this mainly over long duration exercise. But mechanism-wise, so hormones play a role here. So during long duration exercise, some hormones increase, which increase fat metabolism. That includes not only your catecholamines, but potentially cortisol. And then it's also possible during long duration exercise that glycogen, your storage form of carbohydrate, starts to get depleted. And that's going to force your body to start relying more and more on fat as duration goes on. So as far as the sources of carbohydrate and fat, so carbohydrate, we'll break it down into two major sources. You can either use what's already in the muscle, and we'll call that muscle glycogen, or you can get glucose from out in the blood, plasma, and that could be glucose coming from the liver that's taken out of the liver and transported in the blood. But then remember, you have to get that glucose into the muscle cell. And then as far as fat, kind of the same thing. We do have some fat stored in skeletal muscle. We call that intramuscular triglycerides. And then we also have fat that comes from elsewhere in the body. We'll break those into, we'll just say those are fatty acids in the blood, free fatty acids in the blood. And those could just be coming from adipose tissue elsewhere in the body. So how does intensity and duration influence our sources of fat and carbohydrate? So carbohydrate's relatively clear cut. So I want to show you this graph first, which actually shows both fat and carbohydrate, but I want to focus on the carbohydrate. So if we look at everything that I bracketed in red, that's carbohydrate. So that's our muscle glycogen in blue, our plasma glucose, our blood glucose in this shade right here. So on the x-axis of this graph, we have intensity again. So it's not continuous, so it's 25%, 65%, 85%. And then this is percent of the fuel source that you're using. So the first thing I want you to notice is the crossover concept. So you're seeing as intensity goes up, there's more and more carbohydrate overall being utilized. And everything I bracketed in blue is fat. So that's plasma free fatty acids, or in this shade, or muscle triglycerides in this shade. So you can see more and more carbohydrate, less and less fat. So that's the crossover concept that we've already discussed. Looking specifically at the sources of carbohydrate, you can see as intensity goes up, there's a clear reliance on more and more muscle glycogen. So you see this little blue strip gets bigger and bigger. So key point, as exercise intensity goes up, you rely more and more on muscle glycogen as opposed to plasma glucose. For fat, it's not quite as clear cut, but I would say in general, you're going to get a similar response. So the higher the intensity, the less free fatty acids that you're using from the blood. And even though it doesn't necessarily look like it here, it's kind of that going in that direction, but like I said, it's like less clear. So carbohydrates really clear, fats kind of going in that direction, but not exactly as clear cut. So as far as the rationale for this, I wanted to just think about it in a simple way. As intensity goes up, you tend to rely more and more on what's within the muscle. And that makes complete sense when you think about it. So when intensity is high and you need energy really quickly, it's easier for the body to use what's already in the muscle instead of trying to get it from out in the blood. And that's an easy way to kind of remember what's going on as far as the sources of carbohydrate and or fat. All right, so duration also impacts this. So on this graph, we're looking at duration, so exercise time up to 4 hours of exercising, percent energy expenditure here on the y-axis. Again, for fat, it's not as clear cut. I mean, it looks like it here, but I'm going to focus more on the carbohydrate because I find this to be a lot more consistent. So as duration continues, so we're assuming a submaximal intensity. In this graph, 4 hours of exercising. So this could be like running a marathon. So as duration increases, we rely more and more on blood glucose as opposed to muscle glycogen. And that could be as simple as we are running out of muscle glycogen, which is actually really common during long duration exercise. And once you get to over 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, glycogen can be depleted. And that's obviously going to affect exercise performance. But that's what you're seeing here. So it's going to force the body to rely more and more on plasma glucose as duration goes on. All right, so looking at this in a slightly different way, now we're going to look at it related to energy pathways. So I'm going to call this the energy continuum. And it's not a perfect graph. I drew this in PowerPoint, but on the x-axis we have time, and 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, up to 5 minutes. And even though there's no label here on the y-axis, this is going to be percent usage of the 3 major energy pathways that we talked about. The 3 major energy pathways would be immediate, glycolytic, or oxidative. So for this graph to make sense, we have to assume an all-out effort. So the best way to visualize what's going on here, just assume that you take off in a sprint, you're running as fast as you can, and you try to go, let's say, a mile or 2 miles. And so you're running as hard as you can the whole time. And so what this is showing is that that first 10, 20 seconds, close to 100% of your energy transfer is going to be due to the immediate pathway. And so the immediate pathway would be outlined in this blue line. But it's going to kind of trail off quick. And then we're going to have to start relying more on the next energy pathway, which this yellow line would be glycolytic, which kicks in for the majority of your energy transfer from that window of, let's say, 20 seconds up to about 90 seconds. And so it's pretty much 100% responsible. I would never say 100%. So let's say 90-something% responsible for energy transfer in this time window. Then after that, that can't keep up for an extended period of time. So then we have to rely more on the oxidative pathway, which would be described by this red line. And it's going to be mostly responsible for energy transfer from, let's say, on average 90 seconds until you stop exercising, even if you're working at a high intensity. So remember from the previous lecture, we said even high intensity exercise that lasts longer than about 90 seconds up to 2 minutes is going to be relying heavily on the oxidative pathway. So this is the energy continuum, so you can kind of see the contribution of each of those pathways. So a similar way to look at it is looking at it in bar graph form. And so we have different colors here. So we have time, 10, 30, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, up to 2 hours. And so we have aerobic, which would be oxidative, glycolytic, and then this would be your immediate. So you can see the first 10 seconds. The percentages won't exactly be the same for everyone, but they're saying the bulk of energy transfer is due to immediate pathway the first 10 seconds, and that's consistent with what we said. Then as you get into 30 seconds, 60 seconds, the glycolytic pathway is going to be mainly responsible. Then after you get to about 2 minutes, you can see the oxidative pathway really just takes over and is mostly responsible, and I would never say 100%, but mostly responsible for energy transfer after a few minutes of exercising, even at a high intensity. So one way to think about this is that even though, depending on the intensity and the duration of exercise, you may have different energy pathways contributing more to energy transfer, all of these pathways are always active, and that's why I keep saying I'd never say 100%. So even at rest, when we assume we're using mostly oxidative metabolism, there is some anaerobic metabolism. So it's not like the immediate or the glycolytic pathway just shut off. They're always doing a little bit. You have to think of it as like a relative contribution. And so even at this point, 2 hours into exercising, we still have some immediate the immediate pathway is still generating ATP. The glycolytic pathway is still generating ATP. It's just contributing really small amounts compared to the oxidative. So shifting our focus now to lactate. So just to make sure you remember, lactate is produced via the glycolytic pathway. So when glucose or glycogen is broken down, you get 2 molecules of pyruvate, and we said, assuming that the pyruvate that does not go to the mitochondria and is metabolized oxidatively, it is converted to lactate out in the cytoplasm. So even though we associate lactate with anaerobic metabolism, it's constantly being produced. And so even at rest, if you measure lactate in the blood, it's gonna register. So it'll be low, but it'll be present in small amounts. So even at rest and during low intensity exercise, lactate is continuously being produced. The levels are low, however, because it's constantly being removed or cleared just as quickly as it's being produced. So you have this kind of like lactate level that's just constant at rest and low intensities of exercise. And that's because you're producing it, but it's being cleared at a similar rate. So there's no lactate accumulation at rest or low intensity exercise usually. So we'll say less than 50% don't really get any lactate accumulation in most individuals. So the key point here so far is that blood lactate concentration in the blood is dependent on its production and its clearance. So you have to look at both sides to see what's going on with lactate. So as far as lactate production, it's influenced by anaerobic conditions. So we know that lactate is produced in the glycolytic pathway, and that's an anaerobic pathway. So anything that makes metabolism anaerobic would influence or increase lactate production. And then also fiber type recruitment. So fast twitch fibers have a better ability to produce lactate due to their form of lactate dehydrogenase. And so both of these are related to exercise intensity, as you could imagine. So generally speaking, as the exercise intensity goes up, you rely more on anaerobic metabolism, and then you also are recruiting more fast twitch muscle fibers, which are more anaerobic in nature. They have a greater ability to produce lactate. So a key point on this slide is that as intensity goes up, lactate production also goes up. So this is just kind of reiterating where lactate is coming from. So pyruvate is being converted to lactate in skeletal muscle. So what about clearance of lactate? So what happens to it? How is it cleared? All right. So believe it or not, a lot of stuff can happen to lactate. So a lot of people classically and for years and they maybe still today think of lactate as a waste product. It's really not. So some of it is excreted in the urine and sweat, but very small amounts. So lactate actually can be recycled and it's really useful. So skeletal muscle can oxidize it and use it for energy transfer. The heart can also oxidize it and use it for energy transfer. So as far as skeletal muscle, this is a picture kind of showing what likely happens. So assuming that a lot of lactate is coming from your fast twitch muscle fibers. So this is supposed to be fast glycolytic, so like type 2 muscle fibers. Lactate's being produced, gets into the blood, go into the circulation, and then slow twitch fibers actually have a really great ability to oxidize it. And so they can actually convert it back to pyruvate and then basically use it for energy transfer. So that's what I mean by oxidized. Lactate can be oxidized by skeletal muscle. So it actually is a useful fuel source for skeletal muscle fibers. Same thing with the heart. The heart can use it in a similar fashion. Lactate can also go to the liver and go through a process that we discussed called gluconeogenesis. And that's what this picture is depicting. So assuming skeletal muscle is undergoing metabolism, producing lactate can get in the circulation, go to the liver, where lactate is oxidized, basically converting it back to glucose and making new glucose. And if you remember, we called this the Cori cycle, where lactate goes to the liver and is converted back to glucose. So these are all the fates of lactate. All right, so how does lactate respond to incremental exercise? This graph depicts it relatively well. So resting levels generally less than 2 millimoles per liter of blood. And then as far as how it changes during exercise, so the x-axis here we have intensity, so 25, 50, 75, 100%, and lactate level on the y-axis. So it looks like it remains relatively stable, like we said, up to about 50% of your maximal capacity, and then it starts increasing exponentially. And so we get this break point right here. And this is commonly known as the lactate threshold, where you see that shift from kind of like a like it's really stable, and then all of a sudden it just shoots up. So that's known as the lactate threshold. Here's another picture of it. You could ignore the red line here. That's the ventilation, which we'll get to later. But yellow line lactate, you can see it remains relatively stable. So intensity on the x-axis again. So stable, 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 and then there's a point where it shoots up. So again, the inflection point where it really shoots up, that's known as the lactate threshold. There's also another term that's used. It is different though. It's called the onset of blood lactate accumulation, or ABLA. This is when lactate gets to a level of 4. So 4 is just an arbitrary number that's been chosen. But that, by definition, when your lactate gets to a level of 4 millimoles, that is the onset of blood lactate accumulation. So why the separate terminology here? It's actually two different things. But if you think about it, the reason this onset of blood lactate accumulation came about was that it's kind of subjective to pick a lactate threshold, because it's done by, there are computer software programs that can try to detect it, but really what it comes down to is visually. So researchers, investigators will plot it out and then look for that inflection point. So generally in like a research study, at least 2 researchers would look at it and make sure they agree before they decide that's the lactate threshold. And if they disagree, they would analyze it further. Whereas the good thing about the onset of blood lactate accumulation, it's just set at a number. So it's more objective in nature, and there's less subjectivity to it. The other term that you might hear, anaerobic threshold, I put a question mark because even though you see it, and unfortunately you do still see it in research papers, it's just not a good scientific term. And there's been a lot of debate about this, but the general result is it's frowned upon because when you say anaerobic threshold, you're implying that there's a threshold where you shift to anaerobic metabolism, and that's not necessarily true based on what we said earlier. So remember, we always have a little bit of oxidative metabolism occurring, even at really high intensities. So to say that there's an exact point where you shift to anaerobic metabolism is not necessarily true. It is true that you will use more and more anaerobic metabolism as intensity goes up, but there's not really a clear point or threshold where you make that shift to anaerobic metabolism, because it's always a mix of oxidative and anaerobic. So nevertheless, so if you measure lactate and talk about the threshold where it increases, you call it the lactate threshold. If you're talking about the onset of blood lactate accumulation, you call it that. Both of those are great, but I would frown upon calling this the anaerobic threshold. There is another threshold we'll talk about later in the semester called the ventilatory threshold, and that's also fine to call it that if that's what you're measuring, but you don't really want to call this the anaerobic threshold. So what happens to lactate after exercise? So it actually decreases quickly. So lactate is cleared pretty quickly after exercise, even maximal exercise. So within an hour, you're back to resting levels in most cases. Active cool downs can speed up removal because you're increasing the circulation. But generally speaking, it's going to be back to basal levels within an hour. And so this brings up an important point, because you probably have heard in passing that a lot of people have believed, and unfortunately may still believe, that lactate has some type of role in muscle soreness. It has no role in muscle soreness based on this evidence. So if we're talking about delayed onset muscle soreness, which generally peaks 48 hours, sometimes 72 hours after an intense bout of exercise, lactate is already back down to resting levels way before that. So lactate has no role in muscle soreness, even though you may hear that. But unfortunately, for some reason, that keeps getting put out there in certain avenues. All right, so brings up another question. Is lactate bad? It gets a really bad rap. You probably heard lactate called a waste product, or like I said, it may be involved in muscle soreness, which it's not. So it gets a bad rap, but by itself, lactate is not bad. So it's actually a really good thing, because everything we just talked about, lactate is produced. It can be oxidized by skeletal muscle. It can be oxidized by the heart. It can go to the liver and go through gluconeogenesis. It's not a bad thing. It tends to get a bad rap also because as lactate starts to increase, acidity starts to increase during exercise. So as intensity goes up, you tend to produce more and more hydrogen ions, and that's just a byproduct of metabolism. Anytime you hydrolyze an ATP, you're actually producing a hydrogen ion. So the more elevated metabolism is just associated with increased acidity. But people associate that with lactate, and I think that's why it gets a bad rap. So the acidity can be problematic, and so that can impair enzymes because enzymes have an optimal pH that they work at. It can interfere with muscle contractions, also stimulate pain receptors. So the hydrogen ions that are accumulating with high intensity exercise can cause problems, but lactate itself does not. So shifting gears a little bit, we'll talk about how the body responds to aerobically to exercise. So basically how oxygen consumption increases. So oxygen consumption, which we'll abbreviate as VO2, it's a good index of aerobic metabolism. So if we look at VO2 or oxygen consumption during steady state exercise, this is what it would look like. So it's rest, it's stable at rest, it's low. Obviously it's not zero because we're alive. You start exercising, let's say steady state exercise, you're just jogging on a treadmill at 5 miles an hour. And so if you follow this red line, it increases, so oxygen consumption goes up during exercise, and then it's going to plateau at whatever intensity you're working at. So relatively straightforward. So what I want to point out, though, is that it doesn't immediately go up to that level. There's kind of like a lag in that increase in oxygen consumption. So we call that the oxygen deficit. And so why is it there? So even though at this point, this is how much energy your body needs, equivalent. So in other words, you're running at 5 miles an hour during that first 30 seconds, but your oxygen consumption has not made it up to that intensity yet to oxidatively give you enough ATP to maintain that intensity. So how are you actually, if you think about it, how are you actually running that fast even though the oxygen consumption has not gone up that high yet? So the rationale is this difference is made up by anaerobic metabolism, which does not influence oxygen consumption. So we call this the oxygen deficit. So it is a result of the use of anaerobic pathways in addition to the oxidative pathways at the onset of exercise. And even at this point, we still have a little bit of anaerobic metabolism going on. Oxidative metabolism is mostly responsible for our energy production here. So key point, the oxygen deficit is a result of the use of anaerobic pathways in addition to the oxidative pathways at the onset of exercise. And then after exercise, oxygen consumption decreases as you would expect, but it doesn't immediately drop back down to resting levels. It decreases in this curvilinear fashion. And that curvilinear decrease is dependent on exercise intensity, as you can see, comparing light to heavy exercise, and also duration. So generally speaking, bigger, longer, it takes longer for it to decrease after higher intensity or longer duration exercise. So we call this EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. And so the mechanisms for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption include all of this. So we break it into two phases, and I guess I'll come back to this so you can see it. So that first phase where it's dropping quickly, that's called the fast phase. And then where it's that more slow decrease, that's the slow phase of EPOC. So the mechanisms for each fast phase, which is the first 2 to 3 minutes, it's due to replenishment of ATP and creatine phosphate that requires oxygen, and also restoring hemoglobin with oxygen and myoglobin in muscle with oxygen. That all happens quickly, so that's first few minutes. And then that slow phase, it's kind of the long drawn out phase of EPOC, due to hormonal elevated hormones like catecholamines, thyroid hormones, which are keeping metabolism high. Body temperature is still elevated. That's going to utilize oxygen. Cardiovascular, respiratory function, so things like your heart rate still elevated, breathing still elevated, all that requires energy, so VO2 or oxygen consumption is higher. And then lactate oxidation, removal and oxidation, so things like the Cori cycle, all that requires oxygen too, so that's going on after exercise. So as far as the phases of EPOC, so these are the key things that are responsible for those different phases and why EPOC is there after exercise. And EPOC, like I said, it depends on exercise intensity and duration. So after an intense bout of exercise, it could go on for up to 24 hours. So it just really depends on what the exercise bout consisted of. And so if we look at incremental exercise, we have different intensities shown here. So, and this is showing like in hills, which is fine, but it's easier just to think intensities going up. So oxygen consumption goes up also. Even though it doesn't look completely linear here with the way they drew this line, if you drew a best fit line through here, it would be pretty linear. So it's safe to say that there's a linear increase in oxygen consumption during incremental exercise. And at some point, it's going to max out, and that's generally at your exercise capacity is the hardest you can work. And where oxygen consumption reaches its maximal level, that's known as maximal oxygen consumption or VO2 max. So this is incremental exercise. And I have another graph right here that looks a little bit cleaner. So as intensity goes up, oxygen consumption goes up, and it'll peak out at what we call your VO2 max. So linear increase, and we call that maximal oxygen consumption. And it represents your maximal ability to intake oxygen, transport oxygen, and utilize the oxygen in the muscles. And this VO2 max is our best indicator of aerobic fitness. So if you've ever had your fitness level assessed, your aerobic fitness, VO2 max is the gold standard. So ideally that would be measured in a laboratory where your expired air is analyzed. We'll talk about that shortly. But there are different ways to estimate your VO2 max, and they all have their limitations. But so the best way to actually get a VO2 max is to measure it in a laboratory where you're analyzing expired air and you're actually measuring oxygen consumption, and you basically see how high it gets during exercise. So these are some norms. The units are milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. We'll talk more about units shortly also, but you can see for young adults, kind of men, women, what's good and what's bad. So according to this, anything over 53 milliliters per kilogram per minute is going to be in the excellent category, and everything else is kind of based off of that. So you can see there's different norms for men and women. A lot of that is due to just strictly muscle mass, which utilizes a lot of the oxygen. And then age plays a role also. So it's estimated that on average, after about age 30 or so, your VO2 max will drop about 10% every decade. And a lot of that is due to less and less physical activity or exercise, but you do have certain age-related changes that influence that also.